There are rulers who build nations. There are rulers who win wars. And then there are rulers who attempt something far more disturbing. They attempt to conquer reality itself. They attempt to force history, memory, architecture, religion, and even human perception to orbit around their identity. Among all ancient kings, few embodied this obsession more completely than Ramesses II. For thousands of years, his face survived the collapse of empires. His statues still sit in silence across the deserts of Egypt like gigantic shadows staring at eternity. His name remains carved into stone with almost violent repetition, as if repetition itself could defeat death. Even now, after entire civilizations turned into dust, the image of Ramesses still stands. And perhaps that was always the true objective, not simply to rule Egypt, not simply to defeat enemies, but to become psychologically immortal. Modern psychology cannot officially diagnose a man who lived more than 3,000 years ago. Yet when historians examine the behavior of Ramesses II through a psychological lens, an unsettling portrait begins to emerge. A portrait filled with grandiosity, image obsession, symbolic domination, narrative manipulation, and an endless hunger for admiration. Traits that today strongly resemble narcissistic psychology. But this story is deeper than one man. Because the narcissism of Ramesses was not only personal, it was political, religious, architectural, sociological. Egypt itself became a gigantic psychological mirror designed to reflect his greatness back at him forever. To understand Ramesses, we must first understand the nature of narcissism itself. At its core, narcissism is not merely vanity. Vanity is shallow. Narcissism is existential. It is the construction of an artificial self designed to overpower inner vulnerability. The narcissistic personality builds monuments around itself because it fears collapse from within. Grandiosity becomes armor. Admiration becomes psychological oxygen. Control over perception becomes survival itself. The narcissist does not simply want respect. He wants reality to confirm his superiority at every moment. He wants history rewritten in his image. He wants weakness erased from public memory. He wants permanence in a world defined by decay. And this is where Ramesses becomes psychologically fascinating. Because nearly every major aspect of his reign appears driven by symbolic self-expansion. The statues were not normal statues. They were colossal, overwhelming, inhuman in scale. His temples were not merely religious sites. They were theaters of psychological domination. His inscriptions did not merely record events. They transformed him into mythological perfection. Everywhere the eye turned, there he was, his face, his victories, his divine status, his eternal greatness. It was as if the entire civilization had become an extension of his ego. One of the clearest examples of this appears in the Battle of Kadesh. The battle itself took place around 1274 BCE against the Hittite Empire. Historically, the battle was probably indecisive. Some evidence even suggests the Egyptian forces nearly faced catastrophic defeat after being ambushed. Yet the official version ordered by Ramesses presents a completely different reality. According to the inscriptions spread across temples in Egypt, Ramesses stood alone against overwhelming enemy forces after his army supposedly abandoned him. In these accounts, he becomes almost superhuman. The gods themselves support him. He charges fearlessly into chaos. He destroys enemies by the thousands. He single-handedly saves Egypt through unmatched courage and divine power. Psychologically, this is extremely revealing. Narcissistic personalities often reconstruct reality in ways that preserve superiority. Failure becomes betrayal by others. Weakness becomes hidden. Ambiguous outcomes become transformed into personal triumphs. The narcissistic mind cannot tolerate humiliation, because humiliation threatens the artificial grandiose self-image holding the psyche together. The inscriptions of Kadesh resemble this mechanism almost perfectly. Instead of allowing history to portray uncertainty, Ramesses converted the battle into a cinematic myth of solitary heroism. He transformed military ambiguity into eternal admiration. The event ceased to belong to history and became psychological propaganda. And perhaps most importantly, the propaganda was carved into stone. Stone mattered deeply to Egyptian rulers because stone resists death. To carve one's greatness into stone was to attempt immortality itself. But Ramesses escalated this obsession to extraordinary levels. His monuments covered Egypt with relentless self-reference. Temples, obelisks, colossal sculptures, relief carvings, inscriptions, giant seated figures, battle scenes, divine imagery. Even older monuments built by previous rulers were sometimes appropriated and marked with his name. In psychological terms, this resembles territorial domination over historical memory itself. The narcissistic personality often experiences existence as competition for significance. To be forgotten is annihilation. To be overshadowed is intolerable. Therefore, the narcissist seeks symbolic expansion into every available space. Ramesses did this architecturally. He did not merely inhabit Egypt. He attempted to merge his identity with Egypt permanently. The temples of Abu Simbel reveal this mentality with terrifying clarity. Massive seated statues of Ramesses tower over visitors like gods observing insects. The scale is intentionally disproportionate. This is not art designed for equality. It is art designed for submission. The human entering such a structure immediately feels psychologically diminished beside the overwhelming representation of the ruler. This effect matters. Power is not sustained only through violence. It is sustained through perception. A ruler who appears larger than humanity itself creates emotional obedience before a single order is spoken. Sociology calls this symbolic authority. Human beings obey not only force but mythology, and Ramesses understood mythology with extraordinary sophistication. The narcissistic leader instinctively understands spectacle. Spectacle creates emotional surrender. Spectacle bypasses rational thought. Spectacle transforms political authority into psychological awe. Every colossal statue of Ramesses communicated the same message silently. You are small. I am eternal. And this dynamic becomes even more disturbing when combined with religion. Egyptian pharaohs were already viewed as divine or semi-divine beings connected to cosmic order. But Ramesses amplified this divine identity relentlessly. He portrayed himself beside gods not as a servant, but almost as an equal participant in divinity itself. In many depictions, he towers above enemies while divine forces bless his actions directly. This creates a fusion between narcissism and sacred legitimacy. Once a ruler becomes psychologically associated with cosmic order, criticism itself becomes dangerous. Opposition no longer appears political. It appears sacrilegious. The ruler becomes untouchable because his ego merges with divine structure. Modern authoritarian systems often use similar mechanisms. Leaders cultivate near-religious devotion through symbolism, repetition, emotional spectacle, and mythological storytelling. The personality cult replaces objective reality. Citizens begin interacting not with a human being, but with an idealized projection carefully engineered through propaganda. Ramesses may represent one of history's earliest perfected personality cults. And yet beneath all narcissistic grandiosity, there often exists hidden fragility. This is one of the paradoxes of narcissism that many people misunderstand. Extreme grandiosity frequently hides deep insecurity. The louder the self-glorification becomes, the more psychologically necessary it may be. The narcissistic self cannot generate stable worth internally. Therefore, it depends on external mirrors constantly reflecting superiority back toward it. Admiration becomes emotional survival. Without admiration, the grandiose identity begins to crack. This may explain why Ramesses appeared obsessed with visibility itself. His image had to dominate physical space because invisibility psychologically resembled death. Every statue screamed against impermanence. Every inscription resisted oblivion. Every temple attempted to freeze identity against the unstoppable collapse of time. And ironically, he succeeded. Thousands of years later, humanity still speaks his name. But this raises a darker question. Was Egypt serving Ramesses, or was Ramesses using Egypt to feed his symbolic immortality project? Because the scale of resources devoted to royal glorification was immense. Labor, architecture, artistic production, political organization, religious integration, military narrative, historical rewriting. Entire systems of civilization became organized around maintaining the eternal image of one ruler. Sociologically, this reveals something profound about human societies. Civilizations often create gigantic symbolic figures onto which collective identity becomes projected. People seek certainty, permanence, and meaning in chaotic worlds. Monumental leaders become psychological anchors. They embody stability through exaggerated imagery. In return, populations offer obedience, labor, and emotional investment. The narcissistic ruler and the psychologically dependent society begin feeding each other. The ruler offers myth. The society offers worship. And together they manufacture collective illusion. This does not mean Ramesses was uniquely evil. In many ways, he was an exceptionally intelligent ruler operating within the logic of ancient kingship. Monument building strengthened state unity. Divine imagery reinforced political order. Military propaganda maintained national morale. From the perspective of statecraft, these strategies were effective. But psychologically, the patterns remain unmistakable, especially when examining how carefully weakness was erased. Narcissistic personalities fear exposure more than failure itself. To fail publicly threatens the grandiose identity structure. Therefore, image control becomes obsessive. The public must never witness vulnerability directly. Ramesses understood this instinctively. His monuments immortalized triumph but rarely uncertainty. His inscriptions celebrated dominance but concealed complexity. His image remained eternally powerful, eternally youthful, eternally victorious. Human limitation disappeared beneath symbolic perfection. This transformation from human into myth is central to narcissistic psychology. The narcissist does not merely seek admiration for who he is. He constructs an idealized false self and demands worship for that creation. And over time, the false self can consume reality completely. Perhaps nowhere is this clearer than in the artistic depictions of enemies beneath Ramesses. In relief carvings, enemies are often shown crushed, chaotic, desperate, reduced to visual insignificance beneath the pharaoh's overwhelming dominance. The imagery is not neutral documentation. It is psychological theater. The narcissistic psyche often divides the world into superiority and inferiority. Others become useful only insofar as they reinforce the grandiose self-image. Rivals must appear weak. Enemies must appear humiliated. Ambiguity must disappear. Everything becomes organized around ego preservation. Even architecture itself became a weapon of ego expansion. When modern people visit ancient Egyptian sites, they often experience awe. But awe was not accidental. Awe was engineered. Massive columns, gigantic statues, endless stone corridors, divine carvings towering above human scale. These structures were designed to overwhelm sensory perception and emotionally shrink the observer. Psychologically, this creates submissive consciousness. The individual feels insignificant beside the immortal state, embodied by the ruler. In this sense, Ramesses mastered emotional architecture centuries before modern psychology formally existed. He understood that humans obey symbols more deeply than arguments. He understood that repetition creates truth. He understood that scale creates reverence. He understood that if a man appears large enough for long enough, eventually entire civilizations begin mistaking him for destiny itself. But time reveals all illusions eventually. Despite his obsession with immortality, Ramesses died like every other man. His body decayed. His empire weakened after his reign. The colossal monuments remained, but the living consciousness behind them vanished into silence. The narcissistic dream of permanent self-preservation ultimately collided with the oldest law in existence. Everything collapses. And yet even in death, something fascinating occurred. The monuments continued functioning, psychologically long after their creator disappeared. Tourists still stand beneath gigantic statues feeling awe. Historians still debate his greatness. Documentaries still reconstruct his mythology. His face still dominates conversations about ancient Egypt. The ego machine survived its operator. This reveals the terrifying power of symbolic systems. Human beings can project immortality through culture long after biological death. Narcissistic rulers understand this instinctively. They build not only for the present but for memory itself. In many ways, Ramesses was engaged in war against oblivion. And perhaps this is what makes him so human beneath all the grandeur. Because at the deepest level, narcissism is often terror disguised as superiority. Terror of insignificance, terror of mortality, terror of being forgotten by history. The narcissist responds by expanding identity outward infinitely through power, admiration, visibility, and domination. Ramesses simply possessed the resources of an empire to externalize this process on a monumental scale. Most narcissists build social masks. Ramesses built civilizations of stone. Most narcissists manipulate conversations. Ramesses manipulated history itself. Most narcissists seek attention from rooms. Ramesses demanded recognition from eternity. But civilizations built around personality worship contain hidden dangers. When societies organize themselves around idealized leaders, truth begins dying slowly. Reality becomes subordinate to image management. Critical thinking weakens beneath spectacle. Institutions become extensions of ego rather than systems of accountability. The ruler's psychological needs start reshaping collective perception itself. This pattern repeats throughout history constantly. The names change. The costumes change. The technologies change. But the psychological structure remains remarkably similar. The cult of the infallible leader. The rewriting of reality. The obsession with image. The fear of weakness. The symbolic domination of public space. The endless demand for admiration. Ramesses may be ancient, but the psychology surrounding him feels disturbingly modern. Even today's societies remain vulnerable to leaders who transform themselves into mythological symbols larger than reality. Massive rallies, giant portraits, carefully controlled narratives, emotional propaganda, glorified military imagery, divine rhetoric, suppression of humiliation. These mechanisms still function because human psychology has not fundamentally changed. People still crave certainty. People still worship spectacle. People still confuse confidence with greatness. And narcissistic figures continue understanding how to weaponize those desires. Perhaps this is why Ramesses still fascinates modern audiences so deeply. He represents not merely an ancient pharaoh, but a timeless psychological phenomenon, the transformation of human insecurity into monumental domination, the conversion of fear into spectacle, the creation of immortality myths to defend against mortality itself. His statues are not merely historical artifacts. They are frozen psychological declarations. Declarations saying, "I was greater than ordinary men. I defeated time. I became eternal. And maybe the most unsettling truth is this. Part of humanity still wants to believe him. Because humans are drawn toward gigantic figures, we romanticize overwhelming personalities. We mistake scale for transcendence. We stand beneath colossal monuments and feel emotionally seduced by permanence. Ramesses understood this seduction better than almost anyone in ancient history. He understood that if people could be made to feel small enough, they would willingly elevate him into godhood. And so he transformed Egypt into a mirror, reflecting only himself. Stone by stone, temple by temple, inscription by inscription, myth by myth, until finally the man disappeared and only the image remained. Perhaps that is the final stage of narcissism, the destruction of the human self beneath the artificial monument created to replace it. In the end, we do not truly know the private thoughts of Ramesses II. We cannot look directly into the mind of a king buried beneath millennia of silence. But through his architecture, propaganda, symbolism, and obsession with immortal visibility, we glimpse a psyche consumed by the need to transcend ordinary humanity. A ruler who may not have wanted merely to govern the world, but to dominate memory itself. And across the endless deserts of Egypt, beneath the shadows of colossal stone faces still staring into eternity, his psychological echo continues whispering the same message after 3,000 years. Look at me. Remember me. Never let me disappear.